My bakery was failing, and I was hours from closing forever when a desperate old man begged me for one last cake. I said yes, thinking it was a final act of kindness. I never expected that cake would be broadcast on national television, revealing a secret that would change my life forever. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of failure. For 5 years, the air in my bakery, the rolling scone, had been filled with the cheerful hum of the convection oven, the rhythmic thump of dough on a floured countertop, and the light, happy chatter of customers. Now, the ovens were cold, the counters were sterile, and the only sound was the mournful drip of a leaky faucet and the frantic beating of my own heart. I sat on a stool behind the empty pastry case, staring at the crisp, white envelope on the counter. It wasn't a love letter or a friendly note. It was a foreclosure notice from the bank, the third and final one. The words swam before my tear-filled eyes: failure to meet financial obligations, cease operations immediately. Each word was a tiny hammer, chipping away at the last remnants of my dream. I had poured everything into this place: my inheritance from my grandmother, my savings, every ounce of my energy and passion. And it hadn't been enough. The trendy new cupcake chain that opened down the street had siphoned away my regulars, and the rising cost of flour and butter had been a slow but steady poison. I was 38 years old, single, and about to be professionally homeless. My entire identity was wrapped up in being a baker, in creating small moments of joy for people. Without that, who was I? A tear slipped down my cheek and splashed onto the glass of the display case, leaving a tiny, sad little smear. I didn't bother to wipe it away. What was the point? I was in the process of composing a text to my landlord, the kind of message you never want to send, admitting defeat. My fingers hovered over the screen, trembling. It's over. That's when the little bell above the door, dormant for what felt like an eternity, suddenly chimed with a frantic, jarring energy. I flinched, my head snapping up. The door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall, and an old man stumbled inside, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He was ancient, easily in his 80s, with a thin frame that seemed lost inside a neatly pressed, albeit dated, tweed coat. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his pale blue eyes were wide with a terror that seemed far too large for his frail body. He clutched a worn leather satchel to his chest like a lifeline, his knuckles white. "Please," he rasped, leaning against the doorframe to steady himself. "Please, are you still open?" My first instinct was to say no. I was closed. Closed for the day, closed for the month, closed forever. The word was on the tip of my tongue, a bitter and final punctuation mark to my failure. But the sheer desperation in his eyes stopped me. It was a raw, primal fear, the kind you see in someone who is running out of time. I swallowed hard, pushing my own misery down for a moment. "Technically, no," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. I'm closing up." His face fell, the hope draining from it so completely that he seemed to shrink. No, you can't be," he whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Every other bakery is closed, or they said no. They said it was impossible. You're my last chance." I sighed, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. I didn't have the emotional capacity for this. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. My ovens are off, my supplies are packed." I gestured vaguely to the boxes stacked in the corner, a sad cardboard graveyard of my ambitions. "I need a cake," he pleaded, his voice cracking. He fumbled with the clasp on his satchel and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. His hands shook so violently that he could barely hold it out to me. "For tomorrow morning. It's the most important cake in the world." The melodrama of his statement should have been absurd, but his sincerity was gut-wrenching. I stood up and walked around the counter, taking the paper from his trembling fingers. I unfolded it carefully. It was a detailed, hand-drawn sketch of a cake, rendered in colored pencil with surprising skill. It wasn't a normal cake. It was shaped like an open book. One page depicted a star-filled night sky with a silver crescent moon, and the other showed a small boat sailing on a calm sea towards a distant lighthouse. The level of detail was incredible: tiny, edible pearls for stars, spun sugar for the sea foam, a tiny, glowing light in the lighthouse tower. "This is very intricate," I said, studying the drawing. "This would take all night. I don't even know if I have the ingredients anymore." "I'll pay," he said quickly, reaching back into his satchel. "I'll pay anything." He pulled out a crumpled wad of cash and pushed it onto the counter. I looked down. It was a mix of small bills, maybe $100 at most. It wouldn't even cover the cost of the ingredients for a cake like this, let alone my time. "Sir, this isn't about the money," I began, trying to be gentle. "It's for a birthday," he interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "A 100th birthday." My breath caught in my throat. 100 years. The weight of that number settled in the room, dwarfing my own problems. To live for a century, to see a whole world change around you. "He has waited so long," the old man continued, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He thinks everyone has forgotten. This cake, it's a promise. A promise made a lifetime ago. I cannot fail him, please." I looked from his desperate, pleading face to the foreclosure notice still lying on the counter. My world was ending, my dream was dead. What was one more night of work? What was one last act of creation in a place built for it? Maybe this was how it was meant to end, not with a whimper, but with one final, impossible bake. It was a futile gesture, a flicker of light before the darkness, but it felt better than just stopping. I looked at the drawing again, at the little boat sailing toward the light. It felt like a metaphor for my own life, except my boat was sinking. Still, the plea in the old man's eyes was something I couldn't ignore. It was a level of devotion I hadn't witnessed in a long time. The betrayal of my own dream felt sharp and painful, but the idea of being the cause of this man's failure was somehow worse. The betrayal of my own hope was a quiet, personal grief. The betrayal of his was a responsibility I couldn't bear. After the old man, who introduced himself as Arthur, finally left, the silence that returned to the bakery felt different. It was no longer empty and final, but filled with a strange, humming tension. The drawing of the cake sat on the counter, a silent challenge. The small pile of crumpled bills he'd left looked meager and almost sad, a testament to his desperation. It was nowhere near enough, but as I told him, this was no longer about money. I walked to the front door and flipped the sign from closed to open, then immediately locked it. It was a symbolic gesture, just for me. The rolling scone was open for one more customer, one more order. My phone buzzed on the counter, jolting me from my thoughts. It was Mr. Henderson, my landlord. My heart sank. I knew what this was about. I had been avoiding his calls for a week. Steeling myself, I answered. "Clara," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "I haven't received this month's check. The bank called me. They're proceeding with the foreclosure." "I know, Robert," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I have it. I need a day or two." It was a foolish lie, a pointless delay of the inevitable. "A day or two won't help you, and you know it," he replied, his tone softening slightly with pity, which was somehow worse than anger. "The bank is taking the property. They told me you have until the end of the week to clear out your equipment. I'm sorry, Clara. I really am. I loved your scones." The past tense of his words hit me like a physical blow. Loved. It was already over in his mind, in everyone's mind. "Thank you, Robert," I managed to say, my throat tight. "I'll be out by Friday." I ended the call and leaned against the counter, the full weight of my failure pressing down on me. I was making a ridiculously complex cake for a stranger while my own life was crumbling into dust. It was insane. I should be packing boxes, calling scrap dealers for my ovens, figuring out how to file for bankruptcy. Instead, I was planning how to craft a miniature, edible lighthouse. I pushed myself off the counter and walked into the kitchen. The familiar scent of yeast, sugar, and old memories lingered in the air. This was my sanctuary, my happy place, and I was losing it. A fresh wave of grief washed over me, so powerful it made my knees weak. But then my eyes landed on the drawing I'd brought back with me, the little boat on the sugar-spun sea. A strange resolve began to solidify within my grief. If this was to be my last creation, it would be my masterpiece. I would pour every bit of skill, every lesson my grandmother had taught me, into this one cake. It would be my defiant, beautiful farewell. They could take my bakery, but they couldn't take my craft. Not tonight. I pulled out my last bags of fine Belgian chocolate, the expensive Madagascar vanilla I'd been saving, and the organic butter I could no longer afford. I worked with a focus I hadn't felt in months. Arthur's instructions had been incredibly specific. The book must be a deep cob. Alt blue, the color of the sea at dusk, he'd said, his finger tracing the drawing. The stars cannot be simple sprinkles. They must be silver dragées, each one placed by hand, and the lighthouse, its light must truly glow. To achieve the glowing effect, I knew I'd have to hollow out a tiny section and insert a small, battery-powered LED, a trick I'd used once for a child's birthday cake. It was tedious, delicate work. As I mixed the batter, my muscle memory took over, the familiar motions soothing my frayed nerves. For a few hours, I wasn't a failure. I was a baker. As the first layers of cake baked, filling the air with the rich scent of chocolate, I thought about the world outside. The world of banks and landlords and trendy cupcake shops. They had all counted me out, dismissed me and my little shop as a quaint but unsustainable dream. They had already written the end of my story. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. The thought surfaced in my mind, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. I wasn't sure what it meant, but it felt important. What had they forgotten? My resilience? My talent? I looked down at my flour-dusted hands, the hands that could turn simple ingredients into something magical. Perhaps that was it. In a world obsessed with profit margins and marketing, they had forgotten the simple, transformative power of a thing made with care. I began to work on the decorations, molding the fondant for the book cover, piping the delicate waves of the sea. I lost all track of time. The sun went down, and the streetlights outside cast long shadows into my dark shop. It was just me, the warm glow of the kitchen, and the cake that was slowly coming to life under my hands. Around 2 a.m., my energy started to flag. My back ached, and my eyes burned from staring at the tiny details. Doubt began to creep back in. What was I even doing? This was a pointless, exhausting exercise in futility. I was polishing the brass on a sinking ship. I sat down at my small desk, buried my face in my hands, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to cry, my shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. After a few minutes, I wiped my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. I could stop. I could go to sleep and tell Arthur in the morning that I couldn't finish. He would be disappointed, but he would understand. It was the sensible thing to do. But when I looked at the cake, half finished on the workbench, I knew I couldn't. It was more than a cake now. It was a promise. Not just Arthur's promise to his mysterious centenarian, but my promise to myself. A promise to finish what I started, to see it through to the end with dignity. This last act wasn't for the bank, or the landlord, or the memory of my customers. It was for me. It was my final scone. The antagonist in my story wasn't a person. It was a creeping, insidious thing, a mountain of debt, a dwindling savings account, and the crushing weight of public indifference. My bakery, the rolling scone, was born from a place of love. My grandmother, Alina, had been the baker in our family. She never measured anything, working by feel and scent, and her kitchen was a magical place where flour dust danced in the sunbeams, and the aroma of cinnamon and melting butter could cure any sadness. When she passed away, she left me a modest inheritance. My friends told me to invest it, to save it for a down payment on a house. But I couldn't. All I could think of was her mantra. Life is short, darling. Eat the good scone. I decided to use the money to open the bakery she had always dreamed of. It was meant to be a tribute to her, a continuation of her legacy of spreading simple, handcrafted joy. For the first 2 years, it was wonderful. The neighborhood embraced me. I knew my customers by name. Mrs. Gable wanted the corner piece of the coffee cake. Mr. Chen loved the lemon tarts, but only on Thursdays, and young Sarah would come in after school for a chocolate chip cookie, her payment a combination of pocket change and a gap-toothed smile. I worked 18-hour days, my body constantly aching, but my heart was full. I was honoring my grandmother, and I was happy. Then came the changes. The economy took a downturn. A gleaming, sterile cupcake franchise, Cupcake Craze, opened 2 blocks away. Their marketing was aggressive, their flavors were trendy, and they had a massive social media presence. My handcrafted pastries couldn't compete with their perfectly uniform, brightly colored creations that were more photogenic than they were flavorful. My regulars became less regular. The cost of my high-quality ingredients, the vanilla beans, the European butter, the organic flour, skyrocketed. Slowly, the joy began to drain away, replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. I started cutting corners, using cheaper chocolate than less butter. Customers noticed. The light in my own eyes began to dim. The bakery, once my sanctuary, started to feel like a prison, its walls built of unpaid invoices and broken dreams. The true antagonist was the slow, heartbreaking death of my passion. Arthur Pendleton was the complete opposite of that cold, impersonal world. He was a relic from another time, a man animated by a singular, profound purpose: loyalty. When he'd first burst through the door, he had seemed merely like a frantic old man. But as he gave me the detailed instructions for the cake, a different picture emerged. He wasn't just a customer, he was a guardian, a steward of a precious memory. He spoke of the cake's recipient with a reverence that was deeply touching. He never used a name, only he or him. He first showed me this drawing 60 years ago, Arthur had explained, his voice soft with reminiscence. His tweed coat, which I had initially thought was just old, I now saw was impeccably maintained, the wool worn but not frayed. His shoes were polished to a dull shine. This was a man of discipline and quiet dignity. "It's from a book he wrote himself," Arthur continued, "but it was never published. It was a story for someone he lost. He told me, 'Arthur, when my 100th year comes, if it ever does, I want this cake. It will be a sign that a promise was not forgotten.'" There was a profound sadness in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by an ironclad determination. He was the keeper of a promise, and he would not falter, even if he had to knock on the door of every last bakery in the city. His profession, he'd vaguely mentioned, had been in personal service. I pictured him as a butler or a valet from an old movie, a man whose identity was inextricably linked to the person he served. "The details are everything, you understand," he'd stressed, his gaze intense. "The shade of blue for the sea must match the ink he used. The lighthouse must have exactly 7 windows. He will know if it is not right." His specificity was so absolute it was almost unnerving. He wasn't just ordering a cake, he was commissioning a sacred artifact. There was no room for artistic interpretation. My job was not to be creative, but to be a perfect conduit for another's memory. He knew nothing of my financial ruin, of the foreclosure notice, of the soul-crushing despair I was swimming in. To him, I was simply a baker, a craftswoman whose skills he required. In a strange way, it was liberating. He didn't pity me. He didn't offer condolences for my failing business. He simply trusted me with a task of monumental importance to him. His belief in me, a total stranger, was a stark contrast to my own shattered self-confidence. The bank saw me as a liability. The landlord saw me as a problem to be solved. The world saw my bakery as a failure. But Arthur Pendleton saw me as his last, best hope. This frail, elderly man with his unwavering loyalty had become an unlikely foil to the faceless, indifferent forces that were crushing my spirit. He wasn't trying to save me, but by giving me a mission, a purpose beyond my own misery, he had thrown me a lifeline. As I worked through the night, meticulously placing each silver star onto the deep blue fondant sky, I wasn't just baking for Arthur or his mysterious friend. I was fighting back against the silence. I was making one last, defiant stand, armed with nothing but flour, sugar, and a promise I had unexpectedly chosen to keep. The decision to bake the cake was the turning point. It was an act of quiet rebellion. By choosing to honor Arthur's desperate request, I was rejecting the cold logic of my situation. The logical thing to do was to pack, to mourn, to surrender. Instead, I chose to create. This final act of baking became my weapon against despair. The leverage I had wasn't a hidden document or a legal loophole. It was my craft, the one thing they couldn't foreclose on. My investigation wasn't about uncovering a dark secret, but about rediscovering my own purpose. I became obsessed with perfecting the cake, treating Arthur's drawing like a sacred text. The book he'd mentioned, the source of the cake's design, piqued my curiosity. A self-written, unpublished story felt deeply personal. What was it about? Who was the lost love it was written for? In a moment of procrastination from my meticulous sugar work, I typed the few details I had into a search engine. Unpublished children's book, boat and lighthouse story, promise cake. The results were, as expected, a meaningless jumble of blogs and forums. There was no digital footprint for this intensely private memory. The story existed only in the mind of a 100-year-old man and on the drawing clutched in his loyal caretaker's hand. This lack of information only deepened the mystery and made my task feel more significant. I was recreating something that the world had never seen. The most challenging part was the lighthouse. It needed to be delicate yet stable, and its light had to glow from within. I constructed it from hardened sugar paste, piece by piece, like a tiny, edible mason. I used a miniature LED light from a craft store, carefully embedding it within the structure before sealing it. When I switched it on for the first time in the pre-dawn darkness of the bakery, a tiny, warm light beamed out. It was magical. It felt like I had captured a spark of hope in a shell of sugar. As the hours bled into one another, my small bakery transformed. It was no longer a place of failure, but a vibrant, functioning workshop. The air was thick with the scent of melted chocolate and warm vanilla. My counters, once sterile, were now dusted with a fine layer of powdered sugar, like a fresh snowfall. For the first time in over a year, I felt a spark of the old joy, the pure, unadulterated pleasure of creation. The sun was just beginning to tint the eastern sky with shades of pink and orange when I placed the final, perfect wave of spun sugar at the base of the book. I stepped back, wiping a smear of cocoa from my forehead with the back of my hand. It was done. The cake was, without a doubt, the most beautiful thing I had ever made. It was more than a confection, it was a story brought to life. The cobalt blue of the book cover was deep and rich, the silver stars twinkled against it, and the little boat seemed to be genuinely sailing across a shimmering sea toward the welcoming glow of the lighthouse. It was a perfect, faithful recreation of Arthur's drawing. Looking at it, I felt a surge of pride that was so potent it almost brought me to tears. This cake was my testament. It was proof that even in the face of absolute failure, I could still create something beautiful. I carefully placed it in a large cake box, leaving the top open so as not to damage the delicate lighthouse. I was exhausted, my body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep, but my spirit felt strangely light. At precisely 8 a.m., the bell on the door chimed softly. Arthur stood there, looking even more anxious than he had the night before. His eyes immediately found the cake on the counter, and he stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't speak for a full minute, his gaze sweeping over every detail. His hands came up to cover his mouth, and a muffled sound escaped him. I realized he was crying. Tears streamed down the weathered lines of his face as he slowly approached the counter, his eyes never leaving the cake. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch it, but as if to feel the warmth of the little lighthouse's glow. It's perfect," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "It's exactly as he remembered it, exactly." He looked up at me, his eyes shining with a gratitude so profound it was overwhelming. "You have a gift, my dear, a true gift." Coming from him, the words meant more than any five-star review ever could. I had spent the night creating something for a stranger, but in doing so, I had reclaimed a piece of myself. The world outside might see me as a failure, but in this small, quiet moment, I felt like an artist. The confrontation that morning wasn't one of anger or accusation, but of raw, shared emotion. Arthur's reaction to the cake was the only payment I truly needed. It validated the entire sleepless night, the aches in my back, and the monumental effort it had taken to push past my own despair. He carefully handed me another small envelope. "This is all I have left," he said quietly. "I know it's not what you deserve, but please take it." I started to push it back toward him. "Arthur, you don't have to." "I insist," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "A gift like yours should be honored." Not wanting to offend him, I accepted it. Later, I would find it contained another $200, likely every last cent he had. The weight of his sacrifice was not lost on me. As I helped him carry the large box to an old, modest car parked at the curb, a car that had clearly seen better days, he paused. "He hasn't seen the sun in over a decade," Arthur said, his gaze distant. "He stays in his rooms. He believes the world has moved on and left him behind. He thinks all the promises have been broken." It was the most he had revealed about the mysterious he, and the image it conjured was incredibly sad. A man so old he had outlived his own world, waiting in solitude for a sign that he wasn't forgotten. "This cake," Arthur continued, patting the box gently, "this is more than just a memory of a book. It's a promise that he wasn't left behind, that someone still remembers." He looked at me, his expression serious. "Thank you for helping me keep it." With that, he got into his car and drove away, the precious cargo secured on the passenger seat. I watched until the car disappeared around the corner, leaving me alone once more on the silent street. I walked back into the bakery. The lingering smell of sugar and chocolate was now tinged with a sense of finality. The masterpiece was gone. The purpose of the last 12 hours was fulfilled. There was nothing left to do now but face the music. For tea. The next few hours, I operated on autopilot, a ghost in my own life. I began the heartbreaking process of cleaning out the kitchen for the last time. I scrubbed counters that had held thousands of loaves of bread, wiped down mixers that had churned gallons of buttercream, and polished the glass on the display case that would never again hold my pastries. Each action was a tiny funeral. Around noon, my sister, Emily, called. She was the practical one in the family, a successful accountant with a stable life I both envied and pitied. "Clara, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "I'm fine," I lied, "just packing." "Did you call the bank? Did you ask for an extension?" "There are no more extensions, Em. It's done. The dream is over," I said, the words tasting like ash. I sank onto a stool, the same one I'd been sitting on when Arthur had burst in. It felt like a lifetime ago. "It's not the end of the world, you know," she said, trying to be comforting. "It's just a business. You can get a regular job, maybe work in another bakery, one with less stress." I knew she meant well, but her words felt like tiny paper cuts. This wasn't just a business to me. It was my heart, my soul, my connection to our grandmother. How could I explain that to her? How could I explain that working for someone else, baking their recipes, would feel like a betrayal of everything I had tried to build? "I know," I said, my voice flat. "Listen, I have to go. There's a lot to do." I hung up before she could say anything else. I didn't want practicality or well-meaning advice. I just wanted to be alone with my grief. I looked around the empty shop, at the stacked boxes and the barren shelves. This was it. The culmination of 5 years of work, ending in a quiet, lonely surrender. I had made a cake that symbolized a kept promise for a stranger, while all the promises I had made to myself lay in shattered pieces at my feet. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. I picked up a broom and began to sweep up the last traces of flour, a fine white dust that coated everything, like a shroud. The rest of the day was a blur of sorrowful logistics. I called a man about selling my commercial-grade ovens for scrap. He offered me pennies on the dollar, and I numbly accepted. I packed my grandmother's old recipe books into a box, my hands tracing over her familiar, loopy handwriting. Each item I packed away felt like a piece of my own history being filed away and forgotten. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, but the beauty of it felt like a mockery. By evening, the bakery was mostly empty. The echoes of my footsteps on the bare floor sounded unnervingly loud. The soul of the place was gone. I did one last sweep, gathered my bag, and walked to the front door. My hand rested on the doorknob for a long moment. This was the last time I would stand in this room, my room. I took a deep breath, trying to memorize the feel of the place, the way the last light of day fell across the floor. Then, with a click that sounded as final as a gavel, I locked the door and walked away, not allowing myself to look back. I went home to my small apartment above a flower shop, the scent of lilies and roses a constant, cloying presence. It had always felt cozy, but tonight it felt small and suffocating. The reality of my situation was sinking in. I had no job, my savings were gone, and my credit was ruined. I was 38 and moving backwards. Exhausted beyond measure, I collapsed onto my sofa. I didn't have the energy to cook, to read, or even to think. I flicked on the television, not to watch anything in particular, but just to fill the crushing silence with meaningless noise. A local news channel was on, the anchors chatting cheerfully about an upcoming charity fun run. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me. The anchor's voice was a steady, monotonous drone. And in other news, there are reports of some unusual activity at the reclusive Croft estate on the edge of town, an estate that has been silent for decades. My eyes fluttered open. The Croft estate. Everyone in town knew the stories. It was a sprawling Gothic mansion that belonged to Julian Croft, a legendary billionaire philanthropist who had made his fortune in the early days of technology. He was a brilliant inventor and an eccentric recluse who, decades ago, had vanished from public life completely. Most people assumed he had passed away years ago, his death kept quiet to protect his privacy. The screen cut to a live shot from a helicopter hovering over the estate. The long, winding driveway was lined with a few discreet black cars. "We're getting unconfirmed reports," the anchor said, her voice now filled with professional excitement, "that this might be related to the man himself, Julian Croft. If he is still alive, today would be his 100th birthday." My heart gave a small jolt, a hund. "100th birthday, it had to be a coincidence." It was a strange, notable coincidence, but that's all it could be. But then the camera zoomed in on the front entrance of the mansion. A group of people was gathered on the steps, and in the center of them, being carefully carried by two men, was a large, open-topped cake box. I sat bolt upright, my breath catching in my chest. I would know that box anywhere. I could see the top of the cobalt blue book, the glimmer of the sugar sea. It was my cake. My cake was being carried into the Croft estate. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Arthur, the man in personal service. The reverence in his voice, Julian Croft, the mysterious he who had been waiting for a promise to be kept. It couldn't be. It was too fantastic, too much like a fairy tale. The news anchor was practically shouting now. "We are now getting confirmation. Julian Croft is alive, and he is celebrating his 100th birthday today with a small, private gathering of family. This is a monumental story. A man thought to be gone for half a century has reappeared." My hands were shaking. I was gripping the edge of the sofa, my knuckles white. The broadcast cut to a different feed, this one seemingly from inside the mansion, likely from a guest's phone that had been leaked to the press. The footage was shaky, but the image was clear. An incredibly old man sat in a large armchair, looking fragile as a dried leaf. He was rail-thin, with wisps of white hair, but his eyes, even on the grainy screen, were bright and alert. Arthur was standing beside his chair, leaning down to speak to him. The old man smiled, a genuine, joyful smile. And then, the cake was brought into the room and placed on a table in front of him. My cake. My world, which had shrunk to the size of my own failure, suddenly expanded with dizzying speed. The stakes of my all-night baking session had been so much higher than I could have ever imagined. That wasn't just a cake for a lonely old man. It was a cake for a living legend. It was the centerpiece of one of the biggest news stories of the year, and I had made it. The television screen became my entire universe. The shaky phone footage was replaced by a professional news feed from a single camera that had been allowed inside. The nation, it seemed, was now a guest at Julian Croft's 100th birthday party. The newscaster's voice was hushed, filled with the kind of awe usually reserved for historic events. "We are being granted unprecedented access to this intensely private moment," she whispered. For decades, the world believed Julian Croft was gone. Today, we learn he has been living in quiet seclusion, waiting, we're told, for this very day. The camera focused on Julian Croft as he gazed at the cake. His frail hands were clasped in his lap, but his eyes were alive with an energy that defied his age. He looked at the cake not as a dessert, but as one might look at a long-lost friend. He leaned forward, his voice a frail, reedy whisper that was picked up by a nearby microphone. "The sea of memories," he said, his eyes tracing the sugar waves. "And the lighthouse of hope. It is just as I drew it for her all those years ago." A woman, who the newscaster identified as Julian's great-grandniece, knelt by his chair. "Who was it for, Uncle Julian?" Julian Croft turned his gaze from the cake to her, and his expression was filled with a lifetime of love and loss. "It was for a girl named Billionaire," he said, and the name hit me with the force of a physical blow. Billionaire. My grandmother's name, my baker grandmother who had taught me everything. The one whose inheritance I had used to start the bakery. My mind reeled, scrambling to make sense of the impossible. Coincidence? It had to be. My grandmother had been a simple woman, a baker's wife. She had never known any billionaires. But then Julian Croft spoke again. "Her last name was Vance, Billionaire Vance. She was the love of my life. Her father was a baker. He disapproved of me, a penniless inventor with wild dreams. He forbade us from seeing each other. I promised her that I would make my fortune and come back for her. I wrote her a story, a silly little book, about a sailor who promised to cross any sea to get back to his love, guided by her lighthouse." My breath hitched. My grandmother's maiden name was Billionaire Vance. "But I was too slow," Julian continued, his voice thick with an ancient grief. "By the time I came back for her, she had married. She had honored her father's wishes. I was told she was happy, so I left and I never bothered her again. But I never forgot my promise, and I always wondered if she remembered our story." On the screen, Arthur stepped forward and gently pointed to the side of the cake, a detail I hadn't even been asked to make, one I had added myself. It was a tiny, almost unnoticeable detail, a small scroll of fondant piped with a single word in gold icing. It was the name of my bakery. The R. Alling Scone. Julian Croft leaned closer, squinting to read the word. His eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of true shock crossed his ancient face. He looked at Arthur, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning wonder. "The rolling scone? Arthur, what is this?" Arthur smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Sir, I did not know until this morning when I picked it up. When I saw the name of the bakery, I made a call to the city records. Billionaire Vance, she married a man named Robert Evans. They had one son, and that son had a daughter." He turned his gaze slightly, as if he could see me through the television. "A baker, who owns a small shop called the Rolling Scone." The room was silent. Julian Croft stared at the cake, then at his great-grandniece, his eyes shining with tears. He had commissioned a cake to honor the memory of his lost love, believing her to be a distant part of the past. He had no idea that the cake itself was the final, closing chapter of their story, a message sent across time from her legacy to his. My grandmother had never spoken of a lost love or a penniless inventor, but she had always had a sad, wistful look in her eye when she'd look out at the ocean. And her favorite thing to bake, the thing that gave my bakery its name, was a scone recipe passed down not from her mother, but from her father, a baker. On the television, Julian Croft reached out a trembling finger and touched the small boat on the sugar sea. "She remembered," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Her legacy remembered." In that moment, the the story wasn't about a reclusive billionaire. It was about a promise that had finally found its way home. And I, in my darkest hour, on the verge of losing everything, had been the unknowing messenger. I sat on my sofa in my tiny apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of my failed dream, and watched as the world learned a secret that connected my humble grandmother to this legendary man, all because of a cake I almost didn't make. The aftermath was a tidal wave. Before the broadcast had even ended, my phone began to ring. It didn't stop for 3 days. News vans camped out in front of my shuttered bakery and my small apartment building. Reporters shouted questions at me every time I dared to peek outside. I was on the front page of every newspaper, my story told alongside the incredible tale of Julian Croft and Eleanor Vance. I was no longer Clara Evans, failed baker. I was the kindness baker, the promise keeper, the unwitting link in a love story that had spanned 80 years. It was overwhelming and terrifying. I stayed inside for 2 days, too stunned to do anything but watch the story unfold on the news. I learned that my grandmother had, in her own quiet way, honored her first love. She had kept a small, worn copy of the story Julian had written for her, a story I now recognized from the cake's design. My father found it tucked away in an old photo album after the news broke. It seemed she had never truly forgotten him either. On the 3rd day, a sleek black car, the same kind I'd seen at the Croft estate, pulled up outside my building. A woman in a sharp suit knocked on my door. She wasn't a reporter. She was from the Croft Foundation, the massive charitable organization Julian had founded decades ago. She explained that Mr. Croft was requesting my presence. He wanted to meet me. Numbly, I agreed. I was driven to the sprawling estate, a place I had only ever seen from a distance. I was led not into the grand, formal rooms, but to a sunny, enclosed porch filled with plants. Julian Croft was sitting in a comfortable chair, a blanket over his lap. He looked even smaller and more fragile in person, but his eyes were sharp and kind. Arthur stood dutifully by his side. "Miss Evans," Julian said, his voice a soft whisper. "The girl with the baker's hands." I didn't know what to say. "Mr. Croft, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," he said with a small smile. "That's what makes the story so perfect. Providence. Your grandmother was the finest person I ever knew. I see her spirit in you." He gestured to the woman from the foundation. "I have spent my life building things, companies, technologies, a fortune. But in the end, it's the small things, the acts of kindness, that truly matter. You, Miss Evans, in your moment of crisis, chose to help a desperate old man. You honored a promise you didn't even know existed." He explained that the Croft Foundation wanted to buy my bakery. Not to close it, but to invest in it. They wanted to renovate the space, expand the kitchen, and provide me with a salary and a staff, allowing me to focus on what I did best, baking. The bakery would remain mine to run, but with the foundation's backing, it would also become a community hub, offering baking classes for underprivileged kids and providing baked goods for local shelters. "We want to invest in your kindness, Clara," the foundation woman said. I was speechless. Tears streamed down my face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy, not sorrow. A month later, the rolling scone reopened. It was beautiful, with new ovens, gleaming counters, and a bright, welcoming seating area. The foreclosure signs were gone, replaced by a line of customers that stretched down the block. I hired a small staff, including a young apprentice baker eager to learn. Arthur visited often, bringing me stories of Julian. The old man, he said, was happier than he had been in 60 years. He had reconnected with his extended family, and the cake, a perfect replica of which was now preserved and displayed at the foundation's headquarters, had brought him a sense of peace. My life had been transformed, not by a lottery win or a lucky break, but by a single choice. The choice to be kind when it would have been easier to be bitter. The choice to create one last beautiful thing before the end. The bakery was no longer just a tribute to my grandmother's memory. It was now a testament to her untold love story. Sometimes, during a quiet moment in the bustling kitchen, I'll look at the framed photo of the storybook cake that now hangs on the wall. It's a reminder that you can never know the importance of a single act. A simple cake had saved more than just my business. It had delivered a message of love across a century, reconnected a family, and given a dying man a reason to smile. And it had taught me that sometimes, your lowest point is just the beginning of a much better story.